In a struggling downtown barbershop in Cedar Falls, a former army medic was about to close for the night. What started as sweeping up after another slow day took a shocking turn when he came face to face with a disheveled homeless man peering through his window. Yves Bryan wasn't your typical barber. For 8 years, he had served as a combat medic in Afghanistan, known for saving lives under fire. When he offered the vagrant a free haircut, he had no idea he was about to discover an impossible debt. What began as simple kindness would become a story of heroism and redemption that would transform an entire community. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October rain drummed against the window of Bryan's barbershop with the persistence of unpaid bills. Yves Bryan stood behind his empty chair, methodically cleaning his tools with the same precision he'd once used to clean surgical instruments in field hospitals half a world away. Each motion was deliberate. Wipe the blade, check the edge, return it to its designated spot. Order in chaos, control where there had been none. $23.47. That's what the day had yielded. He counted the crumpled bills twice, then slipped them into the register alongside the eviction notice that had arrived that morning. Frank Morrison's letterhead bore the corporate logo of Morrison Development, clean lines and bold fonts that spoke of progress and profit. The letter's language was equally crisp. 60 days to vacate unless Yves accepted the buyout offer. The neighborhood was changing, Morrison had written. Time to embrace the future. The future, it seemed, had no place for a struggling barbershop, run by a man whose hands sometimes shook when the memories hit too hard. "Boss, you sure you don't want me to stay and help close up?" Tommy Chen's voice carried the weight of unspoken concern. The 22-year-old had been Yves' apprentice for 8 months now, learning the trade with the enthusiasm of someone who believed in second chances. Tommy's optimism had been a lifeline some days, his easy chatter filling the silence that otherwise consumed the shop. "Go on home to your family," Yves replied, not looking up from organizing his station. "Your mother's expecting you for dinner." Tommy lingered near the door, his reflection caught in the rain-streaked window. "The neighborhood association meeting is tomorrow night. Elena Vasquez thinks we might be able to fight the development, if enough people show up." Yves had heard about Elena, the community organizer who'd grown up 3 blocks away and returned after college to wage war against gentrification. Her father had died in Iraq when she was 12. Tommy had mentioned that detail once, as if it explained her fierce protectiveness of the community. Maybe it did. "Fighting takes money we don't have," Yves said, finally meeting Tommy's eyes. In the mirror, "Sometimes you have to know when you're beat." Something shifted in Tommy's expression. Disappointment, maybe, or the recognition that his mentor carried wounds deeper than the shop's financial struggles. The young man nodded once and stepped into the rain, leaving Yves alone with the sound of water against glass and the weight of accumulated failures. The barbershop felt larger when empty. 3 chairs, though only one saw regular use anymore. Vintage photographs lined the walls, scenes from the neighborhood's heyday when Cedar Falls' downtown thrived with family businesses and blue-collar prosperity. The shop had belonged to an old Italian barber named Gino before Yves bought it. With his military disability payments and savings, Gino's daughter had been eager to sell to someone who'd preserve the shop's character rather than gut it for condos. That was 3 years ago, before the trendy coffee shops and boutique stores began appearing like markers of some inexorable advance, before long-time residents started selling to developers who saw potential where others saw home. Yves swept the floor with the same methodical attention he gave everything else. Muscle memory from military service. Clean your equipment, maintain your space, stay ready. For what? He was never sure anymore. The medic bag in the back room remained fully stocked, though he hadn't treated anything more serious than a shaving nick in months. Movement outside caught his attention. A figure stood beneath the broken streetlight across from the shop, partially hidden by the shadow of a construction sign advertising Morrison Development's upcoming Cedar Falls Commons. Luxury condos, starting in the mid-400s. The man was studying the barbershop with an intensity that made Yves pause in his sweeping. Disheveled was the kindest description. The stranger's clothes hung loose on a frame that had once carried more weight. His hair was long, unkempt, grey, threading through brown in patterns that suggested he was younger than he appeared. Something about his posture, the way he held himself, despite obvious hardship, spoke to training that ran deeper than civilian experience. Yves recognized that bearing. It was the way soldiers stood when they thought no one was looking, maintaining dignity, even when everything else had fallen apart. The man noticed Yves watching and started to turn away. The movement was sharp, defensive, the instinct of someone who'd learned to avoid attention. But something made him pause, maybe the gentle light spilling from the barbershop window or the sight of Yves still working despite the late hour. Their eyes met through the rain-streaked glass. Yves set down his broom and walked to the door. His hand hesitated on the handle as competing impulses warred within him. The smart thing was to lock up and go upstairs to his apartment, to another evening of instant dinner and cable news that barely penetrated the static in his head. The shop was already failing. He didn't need complications. But the man outside looked like Yves felt most days. Lost, tired, holding on to something that might be hope or might just be stubbornness. "We're closed," Yves called through the glass, then immediately felt like an ass for stating the obvious. The stranger nodded and turned to go. "But if you need a haircut, I've got time." The words surprised Yves as much as they seemed to surprise the man outside. They stood looking at each other through the door for a long moment, both seeming to recognize that something small but significant was happening. The stranger approached slowly, each step deliberate. Up close, Yves could see intelligence in the man's eyes, despite the obvious signs of rough living. There was something familiar in the way he carried himself, though Yves couldn't place what. "I don't have money for a cut," the man said. His voice carried traces of education and better days, like good shoes worn down to nothing. Didn't ask for any. Yves opened the door wider. "Come in out of the rain." The man hesitated, pride warring with practical need. "Name's Danny Sullivan. Yves Bryan, have a seat." Danny entered like he was stepping into a church, respectful, uncertain of his welcome. He took in the shop's details with the same careful attention Yves had noticed through the window. Military habits died hard. "Been a while since I've been inside a real barbershop," Danny said, settling into the chair. "Places like this are getting rare." Yves draped the cape around Danny's shoulders and began studying his hair with professional assessment. The man needed more than a trim. He needed the kind of attention that suggested someone still saw him as worth the effort. "You served," Yves said. It wasn't a question. The bearing was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Danny stiffened slightly. "Army. 2 tours in Afghanistan. You?" "Medic. Same theater." Yves began working, his hands finding their rhythm. "What unit?" "2nd Infantry. You?" The conversation continued in the careful way veterans spoke to each other, sharing enough to establish connection without diving into the details that lived in nightmares. Yves found himself relaxing as he worked, the familiar routine of cutting hair combining with the unexpected comfort of talking to someone who understood. Danny's hair began to reveal its true color as Yves trimmed away months of neglect. Grey, at the temples, but not as old as the streets had made him appear. There was something distinguished emerging, the ghost of who this man had been before whatever brought him to sleeping rough in Cedar Falls. "This is good work," Danny said, studying himself in the mirror. "Feels like being human again." The words carried weight Yves recognized. The feeling of being seen, of mattering, of existing as more than just a problem to be managed or avoided. It was what he'd been chasing in this shop, the simple dignity of useful work, of serving others. As Yves made the final touches, both men seemed reluctant for the moment to end. The rain continued its steady percussion against the window, but inside the shop felt warm, insulated from the world's harsher realities. "I appreciate this," Danny said, running his hand through his newly cut hair. "More than you know." "Everyone deserves to feel human," Yves replied, meaning it. Danny stood and moved toward the door, then paused. "You're good people, Yves Bryan. Don't let them tell you different." The words carried an odd weight, as if Danny knew something about the pressures Yves faced. He watched through the window. As the man walked away, his stride somehow steadier than it had been an hour earlier. Yves finished cleaning up, but found himself glancing repeatedly at the window. Something about the encounter had shifted something inside him, a reminder of why he'd opened the shop in the first place. Not for profit or recognition, but for moments like this. Small acts of service that honored what he'd learned in the army about looking out for each other. He turned off the lights and headed upstairs, unaware that across town, Danny Sullivan was looking at himself in a public restroom mirror and remembering, for the first time in months, what it felt like to have hope. The rain continued falling on Cedar Falls, washing the streets clean for whatever came next. The rain had stopped by morning, but Yves could still hear its echo in his dreams. He'd woken at 0500 hours. Old habits never died, with Danny Sullivan's. Words lingering in his mind like smoke from a distant fire. "You're good people, Yves Bryan. Don't let them tell you different." The coffee maker sputtered to life in his small apartment above the shop, its mechanical wheezing a familiar companion to the silence. Through the window, Cedar Falls was awakening. Reluctantly, streetlights surrendering to grey dawn, early commuters hunched against the October chill. The Morrison development sign across the street caught the morning light like a promise or a threat, depending on your perspective. Yves descended to the shop earlier than usual, muscle memory guiding him through the ritual of preparation. Sweep the floor, check the tools, organize the station. The routine was meditation and armor both, a way of holding chaos at bay through deliberate action. But this morning felt different. The encounter with Danny had disturbed something in the careful equilibrium Yves had constructed. He was adjusting the barber pole when Tommy arrived, 20 minutes before his usual time. The young man's face was flushed with excitement. His phone clutched in his hand like a winning lottery ticket. "Boss, you need to see this," Tommy said, practically bouncing on his toes. "The video I posted last night, it's blown up." Yves felt his stomach drop. "What video?" Tommy's expression shifted to uncertainty as he read Eva's tone. I filmed a little bit of you cutting that homeless guy's hair last night. Nothing invasive, just a short clip showing the kindness, you know. I thought it might help people see what this place is really about." The phone screen showed a 30-second video shot through the window, Yves draping the cape around Danny, their conversation visible but inaudible, the gentle concentration on Yves' face as he worked. The caption read, "Local barber gives free haircut to homeless veteran. This is what community looks like. Cedar Falls, at your veteran support, at your small business." 2,000 shares overnight, Tommy said, his voice dropping to match Yves' obvious discomfort. "Local news stations are already calling. Channel 7 wants to do a story." Yves handed the phone back without watching the full video. The weight of unwanted attention settled on his shoulders like a familiar pack. Heavy, uncomfortable, but somehow expected. He joined the army to serve, not to be served or celebrated. The idea of cameras and reporters felt like a violation of something sacred about what had happened the night before. "Take it down," he said. "Boss, take it down, Tommy." The bell above the door chimed, saving them both from the argument that was building. Maria Santos entered with the careful dignity of someone who'd spent 73 years refusing to let the world break her spirit. Her weekly appointment was one of the few reliable constants in Yves' schedule, every Tuesday at 8 a.m. for a wash and set that she could probably do herself, but chose not to. "Good morning, mijo," she said, hanging her coat on the hook by the door. Her eyes took in Tommy's expression and Yves's rigid posture with the sharp assessment of a woman who'd raised 5 children and buried a husband. "Everything all right?" "Just some business discussion, Mrs. Santos," Yves said, forcing his voice to level calm. Tommy was just leaving for his morning coffee run. Tommy opened his mouth to protest, caught Maria's warning look and nodded instead. "The usual for you, Mrs. Santos. And boss, I'll get you that thing we talked about." The emphasis on thing suggested the video conversation wasn't over, just postponed. When Tommy left, Maria settled into the chair with the satisfied sigh of someone claiming their rightful territory. "That boy's got good intentions and a big mouth," she said. "Not always a comfortable combination." Yves began working on her hair, his hands finding their rhythm in the familiar routine. Maria had been coming to this shop since before he'd bought it, back when old Gino ran it with stories and strong coffee. She'd adopted Yves the way the neighborhood adopted strays, cautiously at first, then with fierce loyalty. "I heard you. Helped someone last night," she said, watching him in the mirror. "Word travels fast around here. Just gave a man a haircut. A veteran." It wasn't a question. Maria had a way of knowing things before they became general knowledge. Her late husband had come back from Vietnam broken in ways that took decades to heal, if they ever really did. She understood the particular weight that service members carried. "He served in Afghanistan," Yves said, then immediately regretted sharing even that much. "Like you did." Again, not a question. They danced around his military service for 3 years, Maria respecting his privacy while making it clear she was available if he needed to talk. Sometimes the most profound kindness was knowing when not to push. "Roberto used to have nightmares," she said, her voice carrying the particular gentleness reserved for painful memories. For years after he came home, he'd wake up fighting enemies that weren't there, calling out names of boys who didn't make it back. The VA doctors, they didn't understand much back then. Told him to forget, move on, be grateful he survived. Yves' hands stilled for a moment. In the mirror, he could see Maria watching him with the patient attention of someone who'd learned that healing happened in its own time. "What helped him?" he asked. "Knowing he wasn't alone, finding other men who carried the same weight, and work, something that used his hands, gave him purpose. He became a carpenter, built half the houses in this neighborhood before arthritis took his grip." The parallel wasn't lost on Yves. The barbershop was his carpentry, a place where his training as a medic translated into caring for people in smaller, safer ways. Clean cuts instead of closing wounds, gentle conversation instead of triage decisions that haunted his sleep. "This neighborhood's changing," Maria continued. "Young families moving out, developers moving in. But some things shouldn't change. Some things are worth fighting for." Through the window, Yves could see Tommy returning with coffee and what looked like a determined expression. The morning light was strengthening, bringing with it the promise of phone calls from reporters and questions he didn't want to answer. "The man I helped last night," Yves said slowly. "There was something familiar about him. Can't place what." Maria's reflection smiled with the knowing look of someone who'd lived long enough to believe in meaningful coincidences. Sometimes the people we're meant to help find us when we need them most. Sometimes it works both ways. Tommy pushed through the door with coffee and barely contained energy. Behind him, a woman in her 30s approached with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. Elena Vasquez, Eve realized, the community organizer Tommy had mentioned. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her eyes held the fire of someone who'd spent years fighting uphill battles. "Mr. Bryan," she said, extending her hand as Tommy made hasty introductions. "I'm Elena Vasquez. I think we need to talk about what happened here last night, and what it might mean for this neighborhood." Yves found himself caught between Maria's encouraging nod, Tommy's hopeful expression, and Eleanor's intense focus. Outside, Cedar Falls was fully awake now, the morning rush beginning to populate the streets with people heading to jobs and lives that felt more certain than his own. The video Tommy had posted was spreading through social media like ripples in still water, each share carrying the story further from Yves' control. Somewhere in the city, Danny Sullivan was beginning another day of survival, unaware that their brief encounter was becoming something larger than either of them had intended. In the distance, Yves could hear the sound of construction, Morrison Development's crews beginning another day of transformation, reshaping the neighborhood into something profitable and unfamiliar. Change was coming whether he wanted it or not. The only question was whether he'd be part of shaping it or simply caught in its wake. Change was coming whether he wanted it or not. The only question was whether he'd be part of shaping it or simply caught in its wake. By afternoon, the question had become academic. Tommy's phone rang constantly. Local news stations, bloggers, even a producer from a morning talk show in Chicago who'd somehow gotten wind of the story. The video had reached 15,000 shares and climbing, each notification on Tommy's phone like another weight added to Yves' shoulders. "Mr. Bryan, you have to understand," Elena said, leaning forward in the client chair she'd commandeered for their impromptu meeting. "This isn't just about your barbershop anymore. Morrison Development has been systematically buying up properties, forcing out long-time residents, destroying the character of this neighborhood. But your story, what you did for that veteran, it's exactly the kind of thing that shows what we're really fighting to preserve." Yves continued cleaning his tools with mechanical precision, each motion a small act of defiance against the chaos swirling around him. "I gave a man a haircut, that's all." "That's everything," Elena countered. "In a world that increasingly sees homeless veterans as problems to be managed instead of people to be honored, you saw a human being worth your time and skill. That matters." Maria nodded from her position by the window, where she'd been watching the street with the vigilance of a neighborhood sentinel. "She's right, mijo. Roberto always said the measure of a community isn't how it treats its successful people, it's how it treats the ones who've fallen." The bell chimed, and Tommy looked up from his phone with relief. Finally, someone who's not a reporter. His expression shifted to concern as he recognized the visitor. "Oh, Mr. Morrison." Frank Morrison filled the doorway with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room. His suit was expensive but practical, his handshake firm without being aggressive. Everything about him projected competence and success, which somehow made his presence in the modest barbershop feel like an invasion. "Mr. Bryan," Morrison said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who'd learned to project sincerity. "I hope you don't mind the interruption. I was in the neighborhood and thought this might be a good time to discuss our previous correspondence." Elena's posture shifted, her earlier relaxed demeanor replaced by coiled tension. "Mr. Morrison, how convenient that you'd show up today of all days." Morrison's smile never wavered as he acknowledged her presence. "Ms. Vasquez, still fighting the windmills, I see." He turned back to Yves. "I've been following the social media buzz about your shop today. Quite heartwarming, really. It's exactly the kind of community spirit that will make Cedar Falls Commons such a special place to live." "Cedar Falls Commons?" Maria's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd heard enough corporate speak to recognize a threat. The development project I've been discussing with Mr. Bryan, Morrison explained. Luxury condominiums, retail space, a community center. Real investment in this neighborhood's future. Investment in erasing this neighborhood's past, Elena shot back. Morrison's expression remained pleasant, but something harder flickered in his eyes. The past is gone, Ms. Vasquez. The question is whether we shape the future or let it happen to us. He pulled an envelope from his jacket. Mr. Bryan, this is my final offer. Triple the property value plus relocation assistance given today's publicity. I think you'll find the timing quite fortuitous. Yves took the envelope without opening it, the weight of it seeming to match the weight of every decision he'd been avoiding. You're saying the video changes things. I'm saying opportunity has a way of knocking at unexpected times, Morrison replied. This attention you're receiving, it's wonderful, but it's also temporary. Social media moves fast. Next week there'll be another feel-good story trending. But this offer, this is concrete. This is your chance to secure your future. Eleanor stood abruptly. He's threatening you. I'm offering him a solution, Morrison corrected smoothly. Mr. Bryan understands business realities. This neighborhood is changing whether we like it or not. The question is whether he wants to be part of that change or a casualty of it. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't quite caught yet. Yves found himself studying Morrison's face, looking for tells the way he'd once studied patients for signs of shock or internal bleeding. What he saw was a man who genuinely believed he was offering salvation. What about the other businesses? Yves asked. The families who've been here for generations? Change is never easy, Morrison said, but it's necessary. This neighborhood has been declining for years. My development will bring jobs, increase property values, attract young professionals who'll invest in the community. Young professionals who can afford $400,000 condos, Eleanor said. Young professionals who'll shop at local businesses, eat at local restaurants, contribute to the tax base. Morrison's tone remained patient, but Yves could hear the steel underneath. Ms. Vasquez, I respect your passion, but passion doesn't pay for infrastructure improvements or fund school systems. Tommy had been silent throughout the exchange, his phone buzzing with ignored notifications. Now he looked up from the screen with an expression of dawning realization. Boss, he said quietly, the veteran from last night, Danny Sullivan, someone's trying to find him. All eyes turned to Tommy, who held up his phone like evidence. Sarah Martinez from the VA called. She saw the video and recognized him, says she's been trying to get him into services for months. She wants to talk to you about helping locate him. Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. The VA is involved. Now, Danny's been struggling, Tommy continued, reading from his notes. But Ms. Martinez says he's got a service record worth knowing about. Purple Heart, Medal of Honor, real hero stuff. The barbershop fell silent except for the distant sound of construction and the occasional ping of Tommy's phone. Yves felt something shift in his chest, a recognition he couldn't quite name yet. Danny's bearing, his careful way of speaking, the familiarity that had nagged at him all day. Maybe there was more to their connection than random chance. Morrison cleared his throat. Well, that certainly adds another dimension to your story. A decorated veteran, you say? That kind of narrative could be very powerful for community relations. Elena's expression darkened. You're already thinking about how to use this, aren't you? I'm thinking about how to honor service while building something that serves the future, Morrison replied. Mr. Bryan, my offer stands. But I should mention that I've also been in discussions with the City Council about the broader redevelopment timeline. Things move fast in development. Opportunities don't wait for sentiment. He headed for the door, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Bryan, You might want to consider having a lawyer review any media agreements. Stories like yours tend to take on lives of their own. You'll want to protect your interests. After Morrison left, the shop felt both smaller and larger somehow. Smaller because his presence had filled it so completely. Larger because the implications of his visit seemed to expand beyond the walls. "He's escalating," Elena said. "The timing of this visit isn't coincidental. He's worried the attention might complicate his plans." Maria moved from the window to stand beside Yves. "That man's been buying up properties systematically. Mrs. Chen sold last month. The Rodriguezes got an offer they couldn't refuse. He's isolating you, mijo." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Yves looked down at the unopened envelope in his hands. Through the window he could see the Morrison development sign, its promise of luxury living, now feeling more like a countdown timer. Tommy's phone buzzed again. "Channel 7 is here," he announced, looking out the window. "Van just pulled up." The weight of recognition pressed down on Yves' shoulders as he watched a reporter and cameraman emerge from the news van. The simple act of kindness he'd performed the night before was becoming something he didn't recognize. A symbol, a story, a tool in other people's agendas. But somewhere in the city, Danny Sullivan was still walking the streets, still carrying whatever. Weight had brought him to Yves' window in the rain. Whatever came next, that connection remained real beneath all the noise. The reporter approached the shop with purposeful stride, and Yves realized his time for choosing had run out. The reporter approached the shop with purposeful stride, and Yves realized his time for choosing had run out. "Mr. Bryan," the young woman extended her hand with practiced professionalism. "I'm Jessica Chen from Channel 7 News. I was hoping we could talk about the veteran you helped last night." Yves found himself backed against his own barber chair, surrounded by people who wanted different pieces of his story. Elena watched with strategic interest, Maria with protective concern, Tommy with barely contained excitement. Outside the Guillaume, cameraman was setting up equipment with the efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times. "I appreciate your interest," Yves said carefully, "but I don't think there's much of a story here." Jessica's smile was sympathetic but persistent. "Our viewers are really responding to what you did. In times like these, people need to see examples of kindness in action. Would you be willing to just talk for a few minutes about what motivated you to help?" Before Yves could answer, Elena stepped forward. "If Mr. Bryan does speak to the media, he'll want to discuss the broader issues facing this neighborhood. The development pressures, the displacement of long-time residents." "Of course," Jessica agreed quickly. "Community impact is definitely part of the story we want to tell." Yves felt the conversation spinning away from him, becoming something larger and more complex than he'd ever intended. The simple act of cutting Danny's hair was being transformed into a symbol, a cause, a weapon in battles he didn't want to fight. "I need some air," he said abruptly, pushing past the group toward the back exit. The alley behind the barbershop was narrow and cluttered with dumpsters, but it offered something precious: silence. Yves leaned against the brick wall and closed, his eyes trying to find the calm that had once come naturally during his military service. Field medics learned to compartmentalize, to focus on the immediate task while chaos raged around them. But this chaos felt different, more personal, more inescapable. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Martinez. "Mr. Bryan, this is urgent. Danny Sullivan's service record raises some questions I think you'll want answers to. Can we meet?" Yves stared at the message, that nagging sense of familiarity returning stronger than before. Something about Danny's bearing, his careful way of moving, the intelligence in his eyes despite his obvious struggles. The 2nd Infantry Division, Afghanistan. the same time and place where Yves had served his second tour. Back inside, he found the group had migrated to discussing logistics. Jessica was explaining how the interview would work. Elena was outlining her talking points about gentrification. Tommy was managing the stream of social media notifications. Only Maria seemed to notice when Yves returned. "You look like you've seen a ghost, mijo," she said quietly. "Maybe I have." Yves climbed the narrow stairs to his apartment, leaving the discussions to continue without him. The space above the shop was Spartanly furnished, military habits translated into civilian minimalism. But in the bedroom closet, behind the extra uniforms he'd never quite been able to discard, sat a footlocker that held the fragments of his war. He hadn't opened it in 2 years. The metal was cold under his fingers as he lifted the lid. Inside, commendation letters, medical certifications, photographs of men whose names he still whispered in the dark hours before dawn. And underneath it all, his deployment records and after-action reports, meticulously filed in chronological order. October 2018, Forward Operating Base Chapman. His hands moved automatically to the folder he'd tried hardest to forget. The IED. Attack that had nearly ended everything. The official report was clinical in its language. At 0847 hours, Convoy Delta 7 encountered an improvised explosive device approximately 2 kilometers northwest of Fob Chapman. Multiple casualties resulted, including Specialist Bryan, who sustained severe trauma and was evacuated to Field Hospital for emergency treatment. But the bare facts couldn't capture the chaos. The sound of twisted metal and screaming, the taste of blood and dust, the strange floating sensation as consciousness slipped away. Yves had been unconscious for 3 days, waking in a military hospital in Germany with gaps in his memory that had never fully healed. What he remembered: the convoy, the explosion, waking up bandaged and broken. What he didn't remember: who had pulled him from the wreckage. His phone rang, startling him from the memories. Sarah Martinez's number appeared on the screen. "Mr. Bryan, I'm sorry to bother you, but after seeing that video, I really think we need to talk about Danny Sullivan." "Oh, what about him?" His service record shows he was awarded the Purple Heart for actions during an IED attack in October 2018. He saved multiple wounded soldiers despite being injured himself. The location matches. Yves' hand tightened on the phone. "Phoebe Chapman. You know it?" The room seemed to tilt slightly. Yves sat down heavily on his bed, the deployment folder scattered around him like pieces of a puzzle he'd never been able to complete. "I was there," he said quietly. "October 15th, 8:47 hours, Convoy Delta 7. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Yves wondered if the call had dropped. When Sarah spoke again, her voice carried a weight of understanding. "Danny Sullivan was part of the quick reaction force that responded to your convoy. According to his citation, he pulled 3 wounded soldiers from burning vehicles while under enemy fire. One of those soldiers was a medic who'd sustained severe trauma." The words hit Yves like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind, fragments of memory he'd assumed were dreams or morphine-induced hallucinations. Strong hands dragging him from twisted metal, a voice telling him to stay awake, to keep fighting. The smell of smoke and the distant crack of rifle fire. "Mr. Bryan, are you there?" "He saved my life," Yves whispered. "It appears so. Danny's been struggling with PTSD and addiction since his discharge. He's been on the streets for almost 2 years. I've been trying to get him into services, but he's resistant to help." Yves stared at the deployment folder, seeing it with new eyes. All this time, he'd been searching for purpose, for a way to honor the sacrifice of those who hadn't made it home. And the man who'd literally saved his life had been sleeping rough in the same city, invisible and forgotten. Downstairs, he could hear the interview continuing, Jessica's questions, Elena's passionate responses about community preservation, Tommy's enthusiastic social media updates. The barbershop had become a stage for other people's stories, while the most important story, the one that connected him to Danny, remained hidden in a military file. His phone buzzed with another notification. The video had reached 50,000 shares. Veteran support was trending locally. People were calling for more support for homeless veterans, for community businesses, for the kind of old-fashioned values that Yves's simple act of kindness represented. But they didn't know the half of it. Through his window, Yves could see the Channel 7 van, still parked outside, its satellite antenna raised like a flag claiming territory. Morrison Development's sign caught the afternoon light, a reminder that all this attention might be temporary while the development pressure was relentless. Sarah's voice brought him back to the present. "Mr. Bryan, I think Danny might be in the area. Someone matching his description was seen near the old railway bridge this morning. If you want to talk to him, I'll find him." Yves ended the call and looked around his sparse apartment. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his purpose, his connection to this place had shifted in the space of a phone conversation. The debt he'd carried for years, survivor's guilt over making it home when others didn't, had taken on a specific face and name. Danny Sullivan had pulled him from a burning vehicle in Afghanistan. And last night, not knowing who he was, Yves had given him a haircut. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony about the ways people found each other. Downstairs, the interview was wrapping up. Soon the reporters would leave. Elena would return to her organizing. Tommy would manage the social media storm. But for Yves, the real story was just beginning. He had to find Danny Sullivan. Not for the cameras or the community cause or the fight against gentrification, but because some debts could only be repaid in person. Even if it meant facing the full weight of what survival really cost. Even if it meant facing the full weight of what survival really cost. The railway bridge stretched across the Clearwater River like a rusted spine, its steel girders weathered by decades of winter storms and summer heat. Yves had driven past it countless times without paying attention, but now it felt like a destination he'd been moving toward for 6 years without knowing it. Sarah Martinez sat in the passenger seat of his pickup truck, a manila folder thick, with military records balanced on her lap. She'd insisted on coming when he'd called about finding Danny, her professional concern tempered by something that looked like excitement at the prospect of connecting two veterans whose paths had crossed, in the most profound way possible. "He's been staying in the old maintenance shed," she said, pointing toward a cluster of concrete structures beneath the bridge's eastern approach. "The city keeps talking about cleaning it out, but budget constraints." She shrugged. "Sometimes bureaucratic neglect becomes accidental mercy." Yves parked the truck and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. Through the windshield, Cedar Falls looked different from this vantage point, smaller, more manageable. He could see the downtown district where his barbershop sat, the Morrison Development signs, marking territory like flags in conquered land. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked. "Danny's been resistant to help, if we come at him with too much too fast." "He saved my life," Yves said simply. "I think that earns me the right to a conversation." They approached the maintenance shed carefully, Sarah leading with the practiced caution of someone who'd learned that startling homeless veterans could have dangerous consequences. The structure was larger than it appeared from the road, a concrete bunker designed to house railway equipment, now serving as shelter for those who'd fallen through society's cracks. "Danny!" Sarah called out before they got too close. "It's Sarah Martinez from the VA. I've got someone with me who'd like to meet you." Movement in the shadows. Then Danny Sullivan emerged into the afternoon light. He looked smaller than he had in the barbershop, diminished by the harsh daylight and the contrast with his surroundings, but his posture remained proud. shoulders back despite the obvious signs of rough living. His eyes found Yves immediately, recognition flickering across his features. "Yves Bryan, didn't expect to see you again so soon." "Neither did I," Yves replied, "until about an hour ago." Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone skilled in difficult conversations. "Danny, Mr. Bryan has been asking about your service record, specifically your Purple Heart citation from October 2018. Danny's expression hardened. "Ancient history." "Not to me," Yves said. He pulled out the deployment folder he'd brought from his apartment, its manila surface worn from years of careful storage. "Fob Chapman, October 15th, Convoy Delta 7. The change in Danny was immediate and profound. Color drained from his face as if someone had opened a valve, and his careful composure cracked like ice under pressure. He stared at the folder in Yves' hands with the expression of someone seeing a ghost. "You were the medic," Danny said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was unconscious for most of it, never knew who pulled me out." Sarah opened her own folder, extracting an official military document with the crisp formatting of citation paperwork. "Staff Sergeant Daniel J. Sullivan, 2nd Infantry Division, Purple Heart awarded for heroic actions during enemy contact." Citation reads, "SSG Sullivan, despite sustaining serious injuries from an improvised explosive device, repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to extract wounded personnel from damaged vehicles. His actions directly resulted in saving the lives of 3 soldiers, including 1 critically wounded medic who would have died without immediate intervention." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither man was sure how to cross. Danny's hands shook as he processed what he was hearing, and Yves felt the ground shift beneath his feet as the final pieces of his broken memory clicked into place. "I remember now," Yves said slowly. "Fragments, someone dragging me away from the burning Humvee, a voice telling me to stay awake. That help was coming. I thought it was an angel or a hallucination from the pain medication." Danny laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Angel, that's rich. Look at me now and tell me I look like anyone's salvation." "You look like someone who's been carrying too much weight for too long," Yves replied. "Same as me." Sarah watched the exchange with the practiced patience of someone who understood that breakthrough moments couldn't be rushed. She'd seen veterans process trauma in every conceivable way, but the symmetry of this particular story was something special. "There's more," she said quietly, extracting another document. "Danny was also awarded the Silver Star for subsequent actions during the same deployment, and after his discharge." She hesitated, looking between both men. "He lost his wife, his daughter, his house. PTSD and addiction took everything." The weight of that information settled over the group like smoke from a distant fire. Yves studied Danny's face, seeing clearly now what had been hidden beneath the rough exterior, the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd given everything and received nothing in return. "I had a daughter," Danny said, his voice cracking. "Rebecca, she was 12 when I came home, 17 when I lost everything. Smart as hell, determined to make something of herself. Last I heard, she was in law school." He looked directly at Yves. "You got to build a life with the time I gave you. I couldn't figure out how to live with what it cost me to give it." The barbershop felt like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than 24 hours since their first meeting. Yves thought about the careful routine of his life, the methodical way he'd constructed meaning from the fragments of his survival. All of it built on the foundation of Danny's sacrifice. "I've been trying to figure out how to honor the people who didn't make it home," Yves said. "Turns out I should have been trying to honor the one who made sure I did." Sarah stepped closer, recognizing the moment for what it was. "The media attention from the barbershop video, it's not going away. People are responding to the story." of community and service, but they don't know the real story yet. Danny's expression darkened. I don't want to be anyone's poster boy for heroism. Look at me. You think the army wants to put this face on a recruitment poster? I think, Yves said carefully, that you underestimate what people are capable of understanding. The barber who gave you a haircut, the community organizer fighting gentrification, the kid managing social media, they all saw something worth honoring before they knew about the medals. Through the gaps in the bridge structure above them, traffic continued its steady flow. People heading home from work, families running errands, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing, while three people stood in the shadows, working through the weight of extraordinary connection. There's something else, Sarah said, pulling out her phone. The video has reached 100,000 shares. Local news has picked it up, but so have national outlets. This story, your story, it's becoming something bigger than Cedar Falls. Danny sank down on a piece of concrete, the weight of revelation and attention seeming to press him toward the ground. I can't be what they want me to be. I can't be the hero they think they found. Yves sat down beside him, close enough to offer solidarity without crowding. Maybe that's exactly why you're the hero they need. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows beneath the bridge. Somewhere in the distance, Yves could hear the sound of construction, Morrison Development's crews working overtime to reshape the neighborhood while the attention was focused elsewhere. But here, in this moment, the only thing that mattered was two men finally understanding the weight they'd been carrying separately for 6 years and the possibility that they might be able to carry it together. The real story was just beginning. The real story was just beginning. 3 days after the revelation under the bridge, Yves found himself standing in his barbershop at dawn, staring at a pile of cash donations that had arrived overnight. Envelopes slipped under his door, bills tucked into the mail slot, even a coffee can full of change with a note that read, "For the homeless vet, God bless." The total came to over $800, more money than the shop had seen in weeks. It should have felt like salvation. Instead, it felt like theft. Danny sat in the barber chair, wearing new clothes Yves had insisted on buying. Jeans that fit, a flannel shirt that didn't smell like the streets, boots that would keep his feet dry. He looked younger, more like the decorated soldier his records described, but his expression carried the weight of someone who'd become a symbol against his will. People keep staring, Danny said, watching through the window as passers-by slowed to peer into the shop. Yesterday, a woman at the grocery store asked if I was the hero from the video. When I said yes, she started crying and tried to give me $20. Yves continued his methodical preparation for the day, but his movements lacked their usual calm precision. What did you do? Took the money. Felt like shit about it. Danny's laugh was bitter. 6 years ago, I was pulling people out of burning vehicles. Now I'm taking charity from strangers who think they know my story. The bell chimed, and Tommy entered with his usual morning energy, though it was tempered by something that looked like caution. He'd been walking on eggshells since learning about the connection between Yves and Danny, treating both men like fragile objects that might shatter if handled roughly. "Morning, boss. Danny." He held up his phone. "Channel 7 wants to do a follow-up story. And there's a reporter from the Chronicle who's been calling about doing a feature piece on veteran homelessness." "No," Yves said immediately. "But boss, this could really help." "Help who?" Danny interrupted. "Help me, because I don't feel particularly helped right now. I feel like a zoo animal that people want to gawk at and feel good about feeding." Tommy's expression crumpled. "I didn't mean... I just thought if people understood what you went through, what you did for Mr. Bryan." "What I did was my job," Danny said, his voice carrying an edge that made both men step back. "I was a soldier. Soldiers don't leave people behind. That doesn't make me special, and it sure as hell doesn't make me a charity case." The tension in the shop was thick enough to cut when Maria Santos pushed through the door, carrying a covered dish that smelled like home cooking. She took one look at the three men standing in awkward silence and set the dish down with the authority of someone who'd raised 5 children and buried a husband. "Sit down, all of you," she commanded. "Danny, mijo, you look like you haven't eaten a real meal in months. Yves, you look like you're carrying the weight of the world. And Tommy, you look like a puppy that's been kicked for trying to help." She uncovered the dish, revealing enough rice and beans to feed a small army. In my experience, most problems look smaller after people eat something their abuela would approve of. Despite everything, Danny smiled, the first genuine expression of joy Yves had seen from him since the revelation. My grandmother used to say the same thing, different food, same wisdom. As they ate, the atmosphere in the shop gradually relaxed. Maria had that effect on people. Her presence was like a warm blanket that made it safe to be vulnerable. But even her influence couldn't completely dispel the underlying tension. "I've been thinking," Danny said, setting down his fork, "about what happens next. You can't keep giving me money and clothes and feeling guilty about surviving when I didn't." "You did survive," Yves protested. "Did I? Look at me, Yves. Really look. You think this is what survival looks like?" Danny gestured to himself. "Clean clothes notwithstanding. I've been dead for years. I just forgot to lie down." The words hit Yves like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on his own guilt about not knowing who saved him that he'd failed to see how his attempts to repay the debt were affecting Danny. Every gesture of gratitude, every offer of help, every expression of obligation was a reminder of how far Danny had fallen from the hero he'd once been. "I don't know how to do this," Yves admitted. "I don't know how to look at you and not see the person who gave me my life back. And I don't know how to look at you and not see everything I lost," Danny replied. "You got to build something. With the time I bought you. You have this shop, this community, people who care about you. I got addiction and homelessness, and a daughter who won't speak to me." Maria reached across the table and took Danny's hand with the fierce gentleness of someone who'd comforted many broken people. "Mijo, you think your story ends with what you lost, but maybe it's just beginning with what you found." Before Danny could respond, the bell chimed again. Frank Morrison entered with the confident stride of someone who'd timed his arrival perfectly. He carried a newspaper under his arm, the Cedar Falls Chronicle, with a front-page story about the barbershop and its hero customers. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, his smile as calculated as his timing, "I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I thought you'd want to see this." He spread the newspaper on the counter. The headline read, "Local barber discovers customer is war hero who saved his life." Below it was a large photo of the barbershop with a smaller inset showing Danny's official military portrait from his service days. Young, proud, everything he wasn't anymore. "Quite a story," Morrison continued. "The kind that really captures people's imagination. I've been fielding calls all morning from people interested in the neighborhood. Investors, developers, city council members. Seems like your little shop has become quite the tourist attraction." Danny stared at the newspaper with horror. "They used my military photo." "Public record," Morrison said smoothly. "Once you're a decorated veteran, your service becomes part of the historical record. People have a right to know about American heroes." "They don't have a right to my life," Danny said, his voice rising. Morrison's expression remained pleasant, but Yves caught the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Actually, Mr. Sullivan, they do. Your heroism belongs to all of us now. It's inspiring, it's marketable. It's the kind of authentic American story that makes places like Cedar Falls Commons so appealing to potential residents." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Morrison wasn't just exploiting their story. He was preparing to use it as a selling point for the very development that would destroy the neighborhood where it had taken place. "You son of a bitch," Yves said quietly. Morrison's smile never wavered. "I'm a businessman, Mr. Bryan. I see opportunity where others see sentiment. This story, your story, it's going to make Cedar Falls Commons the most desirable address in the city. And when that happens, property values will reflect the new reality." He pulled out another envelope, thicker than the first. "Final offer. Take it now, and you can be part of something bigger. Refuse, and watch as the market forces you out anyway." Danny stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need air." He pushed through the door into the morning light, leaving Yves to face Morrison's cold arithmetic alone. Through the window, Yves could see Danny walking away with the determined stride of someone who'd made a decision. For the second time in a week, the man who'd saved his life was disappearing into the streets of Cedar Falls. And this time, Yves wasn't sure he'd be coming back. For the second time in a week, the man who'd saved his life was disappearing into the streets of Cedar Falls. And this time, Yves wasn't sure he'd be coming back. Danny's absence left a hole in the barbershop that seemed to grow larger with each passing hour. The donations kept arriving, checks in the mail, cash in envelopes, even a GoFundMe campaign that Tommy had discovered but hadn't created. The money piled up like an accusation, each dollar a reminder of how badly Yves had misunderstood what Danny needed. "Boss, we have to find him," Tommy said for the third time that morning, pacing between the barber chairs like a caged animal. "He's been gone 2 days. What if something happened?" Yves continued cleaning his tools with mechanical precision, the ritual offering no comfort. He made his choice. Maybe we should respect it. That's bullshit and you know it. Tommy's voice cracked with frustration. "You saved each other once. You can do it again." "I didn't save him," Yves replied. "That's the problem." The truth sat heavy in the shop's silence. Danny had saved Yves' life in Afghanistan, but Yves' attempts to return the favor had only pushed him further away. Every gesture of gratitude had been another weight on shoulders already burdened by survivors' guilt and shame. Elena Vasquez arrived as the morning light was beginning to fade to the grey of another October afternoon. She carried a stack of newspapers and wore the expression of someone bearing bad news. "Have you seen today's Chronicle?" she asked, spreading the paper on the counter. The headline made Yves' stomach drop. "War. Hero disappears after media." Attention. Below it was a photo of Danny walking away from the barbershop, captured by some opportunistic photographer. The story speculated about his whereabouts, quoted neighbors about seeing him in various parts of the city, and included a sidebar about veteran homelessness statistics. "They're treating him like a missing person," Elena said. "Like he's public property now." Yves read the article with growing horror. The reporter had tracked down details about Danny's daughter Rebecca, his ex-wife, even his military unit members. The personal details that Danny had shared in confidence were now scattered across newsprint for anyone to consume. Where did they get all this information? Public records, military databases, interviews with former neighbors. Elena's expression was grim. "Once you become a story, your privacy becomes negotiable." Tommy looked up from his phone with alarm. "There's more. Someone started a Facebook group called Find Danny Sullivan. It has 1,500 members already." The shop fell silent, except for the sound of traffic outside and the distant hum of construction equipment. Morrison Development's crews were working overtime, taking advantage of the media attention to accelerate their timeline. The barbershop's newfound fame was being used as evidence that the neighborhood was improving, justifying faster gentrification. Maria Santos entered without her usual cheerful greeting, her face carrying the weight of difficult news. "I've been making calls," she said, "checking with people who might have seen him. Mrs. Chen at the grocery store thinks she saw him near the old rail yard yesterday. But Yves—" She hesitated. "There's something else you need to know." Before she could continue, the door chimed again. A woman in her 30s entered, dressed in the sharp suit of someone accustomed to courtrooms and boardrooms. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes held the controlled intensity of someone who'd learned to armor herself against disappointment. "I'm looking for Yves Bryan," she said. "My name is Rebecca Sullivan. I believe you know my father." The shop went dead silent. Rebecca Sullivan stood in the doorway like a ghost made flesh, the daughter Danny had mentioned with such pain and longing. She was beautiful in the way that spoke of intelligence and determination, but there was something brittle in her composure that suggested old wounds carefully bandaged but never fully healed. "Ms. Sullivan," Yves said carefully, "I wasn't sure. You'd want to be contacted." "I didn't," she replied bluntly. "But when your father becomes a viral sensation and then disappears, privacy becomes a luxury you can't afford." She pulled out her phone, showing a screen full of missed calls and messages. "I've had reporters calling my office, my home, even my children's school. They want to know about the hero's estranged daughter and why I haven't spoken to him in 3 years." Elena stepped forward with the cautious diplomacy of someone skilled in family dynamics. "We're trying to find him too. He's been struggling with the attention." "He's been struggling with a lot more than attention," Rebecca interrupted. "Do you have any idea what it's like to watch someone you love destroy themselves with alcohol and pills? To have to choose between protecting your children and enabling someone who refuses help?" The words carried the weight of years of pain and difficult decisions. Yves found himself seeing Danny's story from a different angle, not just the decorated. A veteran who'd fallen on hard times, but the father who'd lost his family to his own demons. "I cut him out of my life to save what was left of it," Rebecca continued. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I couldn't watch him kill himself anymore. And I couldn't let my kids see their grandfather that way." Tommy had gone pale, his phone forgotten in his hands. "But he saved people. He's a hero." Rebecca's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Heroes don't get exemptions from addiction, kid. They don't get free passes for the damage they cause when they're too broken to function. Love isn't enough to fix someone who won't be fixed." Maria moved closer to Rebecca with the gentle authority of someone who'd navigated similar waters. "Mija, you're right to protect your children, but sometimes people need to hit bottom before they can find their way back up." He hit bottom 3 years ago when he passed out drunk at my daughter's birthday party, Rebecca replied. "This isn't bottom, this is him falling through it." She pulled up a news article on her phone. "I saw the video of you cutting his hair. The way you looked at him, like he was worth something. For a moment I almost believed." She shook her head, but then I saw today's paper. "War hero disappears. They're already writing his epitaph." Yves felt the weight of every mistake he'd made since learning Danny's identity. His attempts to honor the debt, his clumsy efforts to help, his failure to see the man behind the medal, all of it had contributed to driving Danny back to the streets. "I saw his military records," Rebecca said quietly. "Sarah Martinez from the VA called me. The Purple Heart, the Silver Star, what he did for you in Afghanistan. Part of me was proud, you know. Part of me remembered the father he was before the war broke him." She looked directly at Yves, her eyes carrying a mixture of hope and fear. "But another part of me wondered if this would just be another way for him to disappoint the people who believed in him." Through the window, Yves could see reporters setting up across the street, their cameras pointed at the barbershop like weapons waiting to fire. The story had taken on a life of its own, becoming something larger and more destructive than anyone had intended. "I need to ask you something," Rebecca said. "When you find him, and you will find him, because he always comes back, when there's attention involved, what then? Are you going to save him? Are you going to fix 6 years of PTSD and addiction with gratitude and good intentions?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Yves realized that in all his focus on repaying a debt, he'd never actually asked Danny what he needed. He'd assumed that recognition and support would be enough, that knowing he'd made a difference would heal the wounds that war and loss had carved into his soul. But Rebecca's presence was a stark reminder that saving someone once didn't give you the right to own their story. And sometimes the greatest kindness was knowing when to step back, even when every instinct demanded action. "I don't know," Yves admitted, "but I have to try." Rebecca nodded slowly, something in her expression softening slightly. "Then you better do it right this time, because I won't watch him break apart again, and I won't let my children suffer for his choices." As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. "If you do find him, tell him something for me. Tell him that I remember the father who read me bedtime stories and taught me to ride a bike. Tell him that man still matters, even if he's lost." After she left, the shop felt haunted by the weight of fractured families and good intentions gone wrong. Somewhere in Cedar Falls, Danny Sullivan was walking the streets, carrying not just his own pain, but the burden of everyone else's expectations. And for the first time since learning the truth about their connection, Yves began to understand that saving someone might require more than gratitude. It might require the courage to let them save themselves. And for the first time since learning the truth about their connection, Yves began to understand that saving someone might require more than gratitude. It might require the courage to let them save themselves. Yves found Danny at the railway bridge, sitting in the same spot where they'd first learned the truth about their connection. 3 days of avoiding reporters and well-wishers had left Danny looking smaller, more fragile than before. "I met your daughter," Yves said, settling. Beside him, Danny's head snapped up. "Rebecca? Here?" "At the shop. She's been getting calls from reporters." Yves watched Danny's face crumple. "She wanted me to tell you something. She remembers the father who read her bedtime stories. She said that man still matters, even if he's lost." Danny laughed bitterly. "That man died in Afghanistan." "That's not what I see." "Then you're not looking hard enough." Danny stood, agitation making him pace. "You want to know what I see when I look at you? Everything I used to be, everything I could have been if I'd held my shit together." Before Yves could respond, footsteps approached. Sarah Martinez appeared, with Elena Vasquez and an older woman with silver hair and authoritative bearing. "Danny," Sarah called, "we need to talk." The older woman stepped forward. "I'm Dr. Patricia Reeves. I run the Veteran Transition Program at the university. I'd like to offer you a job." Danny stared. "What kind of job?" "Peer counselor, working with veterans transitioning to civilian life. Housing assistance, employment counseling, addiction support, the kind of work that requires someone who's walked the walk." "I'm not qualified to help anyone," Danny protested. "I'm living under a bridge." "You're qualified because you're living under a bridge," Dr. Reeves replied. "Veterans need someone who's been where they are." Eleanor stepped forward. "The position comes with housing, healthcare, salary. It's not charity, it's employment. Purpose?" "There's more," Sarah added. "The city's considering a community veterans center. They need someone to help design the program. Someone who knows what actually works." Danny's defenses rose. "You're talking about using my story again." "We're talking about letting you control your story," Dr. Reeves corrected. "Your experience becomes a tool you wield, not something wielded against you. Yves felt understanding dawn. Danny didn't need salvation. He needed agency, the chance to transform pain into purpose on his own terms. "What about the media circus?" Danny asked. "That's part of the job," Elena said. "Teaching people that veterans aren't symbols. They're individuals with complex stories." Danny looked at Yves. "What do you think?" "I think you're the only one who can decide what your life looks like," Yves said carefully. "But people need to hear that heroes can struggle and still be heroes." After a long silence, Danny turned to Dr. Reeves. "When would I start?" "Whenever you're ready." Danny looked around the concrete shelter, then back at the group offering different sanctuary. "I'll need help with the transition, therapy, housing support." "All part of the package," Sarah confirmed. "And Danny, when you're ready, we can help with your daughter too." For the first time since Yves had known him, Danny smiled without bitterness. "Okay, let's try something different." As they walked back, Yves felt the weight of the past week transforming into something manageable. The debt between them hadn't been erased. It had become mutual. "One thing," Danny said at Yves' truck, "I'd like to keep coming for haircuts." "It's where this started," Yves replied. "Seems fitting. It's where we figure out what comes next." The morning sun cast long shadows across the barbershop floor as Yves and Danny studied Elena's architectural sketches spread across the counter. The plans showed half the shop transformed into a veteran support center, counseling room, computer, station coffee area for informal meetings. "You sure about this?" Yves asked, his fingers tracing the proposed layout. Danny's laugh held no bitterness for the first time in years. "Brother, I stopped going back the day I pulled you out of that wreckage. Sometimes the only direction is forward." Elena entered with Tommy, who carried coffee and his laptop. "The crowdfunding hit 20,000 overnight," Tommy announced, scrolling through his phone. "There's a whole Reddit thread about veteran-owned businesses. Look at this comment. Donated in memory of my brother, who came back from Iraq but never really came home." Yves felt his throat tighten. Each donation carried its own story of loss and hope. "The city council meeting is tonight," Elena said. "Frank Morrison's pushing for eviction, but Maria's got 300 signatures supporting us." Danny stood slowly, purpose evident in his movements. "What do you need me to do?" The question surprised them all. For months, he'd been the recipient of help. Now he was asking to contribute. "Tell your story," Elena said gently. "The real one. Not the sanitized version, but the truth about coming home from war and finding home doesn't exist anymore. And help me figure out how to make this work," Yves added. "I know medical trauma, but you know the wounds that don't show up on X-rays." Sarah Martinez arrived with news that would change everything again. "Danny, I have someone who wants to talk to you. Only if you're ready." Danny's hands stilled. "Rebecca." "She saw the news coverage. She's been calling for 3 days." Sarah sat down carefully. "She's scared of hoping and getting hurt again. But she's curious about the man you're becoming." "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that you're working hard in recovery, that you're helping other veterans, that you're still her father, but you're also someone new." Sarah paused. She wants to try a phone call. Danny looked around. The barbershop had evidence of a life being rebuilt one careful choice at a time. "When?" "Now, if you're ready." As Sarah led him to the back office, they heard Danny's voice crack on the word Becca. An hour later, Danny emerged with red but bright eyes. "She's studying for the bar exam. My little girl is going to be a lawyer." He sat heavily but straighter somehow. "She called me Danny instead of Dad, and I deserved that, but she listened." That afternoon brought a steady stream of supporters, neighbors offering help, veterans drawn by word of mouth, reporters following the viral story. Maria Santos, arrived with Pozole and news that Frank Morrison was facing serious community pushback. Frank himself appeared before closing, his swagger replaced by frustration. "This is temporary. Feel-good stories don't change economics." Danny stood, meeting Frank's gaze with the steady look of someone who'd seen real enemies and wasn't impressed by small-town bullies. Frank left without another word. As they locked up, walking toward Danny's new apartment above Maria's restaurant, Yves thought about seeds. How something small, offering a homeless man a haircut, could connect to roots deeper than imagined. Tomorrow, construction would begin. Tomorrow, Rebecca might call again. Tonight, two veterans walked like brothers through Cedar Falls, carrying the weight of the past and hope of the future in equal measure, finally understanding that some debts could only be repaid by paying them forward. 6 months later, the barbershop hummed with quiet purpose. The sign above the door read, "The Chair of Redemption," in elegant script, and through the windows, passers-by could see 2 chairs on one side, a counseling room and computer station on the other. The scent of coffee mixed with barbering oils, as veterans gathered for morning conversation before the day's appointments began. Yves adjusted his apron, watching Danny demonstrate proper clipper technique to Marcus, a young Marine who'd arrived 3 weeks ago. Danny's hands moved with the steady confidence of someone who'd found his calling, not in the precision of the cut, but in the healing that happened between the first snip and the final brush-off. "Remember," Danny was saying, "it's not about making them look perfect, it's about making them feel seen." The bell chimed as Rebecca entered with 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, both clutching their mother's hands with nervous excitement. This was their 3rd visit, carefully planned and supervised, but each time felt less like an experiment and more like family. "Grandpa Danny!" the girl called out, her initial shyness forgotten. Danny's face transformed, years of hardship melting away as he knelt to their level. "Hey there, Emma, you ready for that haircut we talked about?" Rebecca watched from the waiting area, her lawyer's careful assessment softening into something warmer. "He's different," she told Sarah during their last session. "Not the man I remember from before the war, but not the broken stranger either. Someone new." Elena burst through the door with an armload of papers and her usual enthusiasm. "The city council approved the expansion grant. We can open 2 more locations by next year." She paused, watching Danny carefully section Emma's hair while telling her a story about a brave princess who cut her hair to help her village. "You know, when I first walked into this place, I thought I was saving a barbershop. Turns out I was documenting a miracle." Tommy arrived for his afternoon shift, home from his first semester of business school. The crowdfunding campaign had evolved into a non-profit organization supporting veteran-owned businesses across 3 states. "MIT wants to write a case study about us," he announced. "Community-driven economic development through narrative storytelling." "Fancy words for cutting hair and listening," Yves replied, but his pride was evident. Frank Morrison had sold his development rights to a community land trust, taking a smaller profit to preserve the neighborhood's character. Some defeats, he'd learned, were actually victories in disguise. As the afternoon crowd gathered, veterans, neighbors, families, Yves found himself thinking about the homeless man who'd peered through his window that grey October evening. How a single moment of choosing compassion over caution had rippled outward, touching lives they'd never know. A young woman hesitated outside, clearly struggling with whether to enter. Yves recognized the look, lost, ashamed, carrying invisible wounds. He caught Danny's eye and nodded toward the window. Danny smiled, understanding immediately. He walked to the door and opened it wide. "Come on in," he said gently. "We've got time for one more cut today." Udino, the chair of redemption, was always ready for the next person who needed to feel seen. 2 years after that first haircut, Yves Bryan stood before a packed auditorium at the National Veterans Conference in Washington, D.C., his hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Behind him, a massive screen displayed images of the Chair of Redemption, not just the original barbershop, but the network of 12 locations now operating across 6 states. "When I offered Danny Sullivan a free haircut," Yves began, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone, "I thought I was helping a homeless veteran. I had no idea I was talking to the man who saved my life in Afghanistan." In the front row, Danny sat with Rebecca and her children, now 10 and 8. Emma wore a small purple heart pin on her jacket, a gift from her grandfather that she treasured more than any toy. Beside them, Sarah Martinez took notes for the documentary she was helping produce about veteran reintegration programs. "But this story isn't really about one miraculous coincidence," Yves continued. "It's about what happens when we choose to see the person behind the pain, when we realize that everyone, no matter how broken they might seem, carries something valuable inside them." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. In the back, Tommy Chen live-streamed the presentation to their social media followers, now numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The young man had graduated business school summa cum laude and returned to Cedar Falls as executive director of the Chair of Redemption Foundation. Elena Vasquez watched from the wings, her community organizer's heart swelling with pride. She'd been invited to speak next about grassroots economic development, but the real victory was seeing how their small neighborhood initiative had become a model for communities nationwide. Frank Morrison, surprisingly, had become one of their biggest supporters, using his development expertise to help other communities create sustainable, veteran-friendly business districts. As Yves spoke about the ripple effects of compassion, Maria Santos wiped tears from her eyes in the audience. At 73, she'd become the unofficial grandmother to dozens of veterans who'd found their way to Cedar Falls. Her restaurant now employed 8 former service members, and her pozole had become legendary among the veteran community. "The hardest part," Yves said, his voice growing softer, "wasn't learning Danny was a hero. It was learning to let him be human. We have this tendency to put our veterans on pedestals, to see them as either perfect heroes or broken victims. But healing happens in the space between those extremes, where we're all just people trying to figure out how to live with our scars." Danny nodded from the audience, remembering his own journey from that first awkward haircut to this moment. He'd been clean for 18 months now, attending AA meetings in the back room of the barbershop every Tuesday evening. His Purple Heart sat in a place of honor in the shop, but beside it was a photo of him teaching Marcus to use clippers, a reminder that service continued in countless small ways. "The Chair of Redemption isn't really about barbering," Yves explained to the captivated audience. "It's about creating spaces where stories can be shared safely, where skills can be learned and taught, where the distance between helper and help dissolves into something more honest, partnership." In the audience, Rebecca squeezed her father's hand. Their relationship remained complicated, built on careful boundaries and hard-won trust, but it was real. Her children adored their grandfather, and Danny had learned to receive their love without the crushing weight of his past failures. Family dinners happened monthly now, and sometimes that felt like a miracle all by itself. As Yves reached the conclusion of his presentation, he paused, looking out at the sea of faces: veterans, family members, social workers, politicians, community leaders. Each person represented countless others who might benefit from what they'd learned in Cedar Falls. A year ago, a reporter asked me what the secret was to our success. I told her there was no secret, just the willingness to start with one person, one conversation, one act of basic human decency. But if I had to identify the real magic, it's this: healing is contagious. When one person finds their way back to themselves, it gives permission for others to try. The applause was thunderous, but Yves barely heard it. He was thinking about that cold October evening, about the choice to unlock his door despite his exhaustion, about how the smallest decisions could reshape entire lives. After the conference, as the group gathered for dinner at a nearby restaurant, Danny raised his glass of sparkling water. "To Yves," he said, his voice still rough but steady, "who taught me that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to help write someone else's future." "To all of us," Yves corrected gently, "because none of this works unless we do it together." As they toasted, Emma looked up at her grandfather with the serious expression she'd inherited from her mother. "Grandpa Danny, are you going to tell the story about the brave princess again when we get home?" Danny's eyes crinkled with genuine joy. "Every story needs a good ending, sweetheart, but the best ones never really end. They just become the beginning of something new." Outside, the lights of Washington, D.C. twinkled in the darkness, but in that restaurant, surrounded by found family and chosen purpose, the real illumination came from within. The chair of redemption had started with one free haircut, but it had become something larger, proof that in a world full of isolation and pain, connection was still possible, healing was still achievable, and redemption was always just one act of courage away. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.